Well, good afternoon. I hope everybody had a wonderful lunch. I'm pretty sure I got the long distance award coming all the way from Bahrain to be here today with you guys, sporting the Bahrain tan, if you will. But wouldn't miss this panel for the world. The way we're going to talk this afternoon about defense, autonomy, and trust is I'm going to introduce each of our panelists. They're going to give a few opening remarks. I have a few questions for them, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If that sounds good, we'll go ahead and get started. As mentioned, I'm Commodore Michael Brasseur from Task Force 59. It's the Navy's newest task force dedicated to the rapid integration of artificial intelligence and unmanned systems into fleet operations. We're based in Bahrain. First, I would like to introduce, got my notes. Let me get my notes organized here. Dr. Jane Pinelis. She's currently at the JAIC, which is now, as we know, been the CDAO. She's the Chief AI Assurance there. She's also the Chief AI Engineer at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, formerly a T&E for the algorithmic warfare at Johns Hopkins APL, and a PhD from the University of Michigan. Jane, could you just give us a few opening remarks?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you so much for having me here today. So as mentioned at the JAIC, I am the Chief of AI Assurance. I've also served as the Director of Test and Evaluation on Project Maven prior to the JAIC. So what is AI assurance, and how does it really relate to trust? In our AI assurance portfolio, we have two main parts. One is test and evaluation. So this is rigorous, continuous, objective test and evaluation of our AI-enabled capabilities, both within the JAIC, but also enabling the services and enabling the rest of the department to produce their own test and evaluation for their systems that they're acquiring. And then also we have, of course, our responsible AI portfolio. As you know, we are the first military to adopt responsible AI or ethical AI principles. And so now implementation of those principles to the systems that we're acquiring falls into, and the governance of those principles falls into the JAIC and the CDAO portfolio. Really briefly on what AI assurance actually means. AI assurance is a framework that helps us build assurance cases or sets of claims for the various stakeholders in the department, but also outside of it, about how our systems actually work, that they do what they're supposed to do, that they don't do what they're not supposed to do, and that the humans that are meant to operate them know how to operate them correctly. So as some of our previous speakers mentioned, there's a certain amount of emerging technology diplomacy, for instance, that has to take place. A lot of that is done through building assurance claims that assure our international allies, for instance, or US taxpayers in some cases, as well as the warfighter, that the systems are an asset and not a liability, and that's what my team at the JAIC does.
All right, thank you, Jane. And next is Dr. Jeff Schneider. Jeff is currently the research professor at the Robotics Institute at the School of Computer Science for Carnegie Mellon University. He's formerly a senior engineer at Uber, Advanced Technologies Group. They worked on Uber's driverless cars. He's got multiple publications, machine learning, AI, and robotics, and he's a PhD from the University of Rochester in computer science. Jeff, if you could give some opening thoughts as well.
Sure, thank you. I know one of the topics that's come up over and over is sort of concern about the U.S. military falling behind in areas of AI and autonomy. Certainly, I've had a unique perspective on that as one of the folks who took a leave from CMU in 2015 to help Uber start its self-driving car program. I got a real perspective on how a tech company pursues autonomy and AI. Versus how that's done commonly in the government or the military. At the same time, since I've returned to academia in 2018, I've also got a perspective on the state of academic research versus where we are and what's deployed. So I've certainly I agree with some of the concerns that have been voiced. On the flip side of that, the Army has recently opened their AI Integration Center on Pittsburgh's campus. I'm on Carnegie Mellon's campus. I'm the director of the CMU side of that collaboration. But I see very positive signs about how different aspects of the military are working to re-engage with industry, with academia, to try to overcome some of those deficits. So I have that, and I think that's an incredibly positive way to start on things. So I'll have that perspective as well. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Next is the Honorable Joe Kernan. He's currently a principal at WestExec Advisors. He's the former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, and he's a retired Navy Admiral, Naval Special Forces, 36 years in the Navy, 1977, graduate of the Naval Academy, and also, I guess, a winery owner, practitioner.
My wife's the owner, I'm the CFO.
Okay, yes. So, sir, any opening remarks from you?
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of comments. And that was my last academic endeavor was in 1977, which I was a 2-0 and go guy, so I'm a little bit out of place with the intellectual capital up here. But let me, I'm coming in just from, as my wife would say, I'm not particularly honorable or intelligent, which goes into my titles. But so I take kind of an operator perspective and view of this thing. At the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Security, I took a big push towards the secretaries and everyone else to embrace AI, to embrace machine learning. I was kind of overseeing the Maven project. I think somebody made a comment on that earlier today. I recognize the importance of it. It wasn't to perfection, but understanding and getting after those types of things. But my most interested piece is how AI and machine learning and those types of things could enable warfighters and people who actually had their hands on and had to use them, and the people that are using autonomy in a way that maybe a lot of people don't understand, and that'll come up. What's the distinction between using it in the military? I mean, there's lots of things. Obviously, you're using autonomy against adversaries. You're in a conflict. They're trying to get into your system. You're trying to get into their system. So it's incredibly complex. But my most probably, obviously, number one, the partnerships that we build with certainly industry that we've, my own opinion, I don't serve for anybody now, has been horrible. Nowhere near what we could be doing with industry. No more near what we could be doing with academia. And then I think the other distinguishing factor, as we talk about later, that always is going to be, as you might expect, important to me, what's accountability? What are the consequences? Because remember, machines they're not going to the green table. The guys who operate in those things are. So how do you actually balance that machine learning with the person and make sure the cognitive piece comes in and drives what the machines are doing, I think is a really important piece. And then training and education for the people that operate, and that's a really important. If you're going to depend on that thing and you're going to have the consequences and all the second, third order effects, getting the military, getting the operators up to speed to be able to comfortably operate those systems. So there's an education process I think is important. But again, I'm a huge advocate, always have been, for partnering with commercial. We just don't do it well, and I'll maybe comment on that a little bit later. But maybe that's enough for me. So.
Thank you, Joe. And finally, Mustafa Suleyman. He's currently the CEO and co-founder of Inflection AI and venture partner at Greylock. Formerly, he's the VP of AI policy at Google. He co-founded DeepMind, which was acquired by Google in 2014. Mustafa, any opening remarks?
Sure. I think one of the things I've been reflecting on quite a lot, lately, and particularly after the discussion this morning, is the opportunities for developing in simulation. In an ideal world for maximum safety, we'd like to believe that we can develop very capable systems that are autonomous and do so in controlled sandbox environments, and that's the attraction of building in simulation. In fact, at DeepMind, we spent many years building very rich, high-fidelity simulations. It was why we've picked games as our development environments for so long, both with Go, shogi, chess, and other games, but also StarCraft, which was obviously of a lot of interest to people in the military. I think the challenge with these environments is that quite quickly you run up against the limits of the design of your simulation, and very rarely have we seen good sim-to-real applications where you've sort of developed well in simulation, and that simulation is sufficiently representative of the physics or the reality of the real-world environment that you can actually carry over your learnings or your insights into the real world, whether it's a military theater or a commercial deployment. Not to say it's not possible, it's just that we haven't really demonstrated very, very good examples of this working so far. And so from a kind of safety perspective, a trust perspective, given the pressures that I know that we feel in defense and elsewhere to make progress as fast as possible with very capable but also very safe systems, not having access to good simulated research and development is difficult because it means you have to do it increasingly in the real world. I think that's a pretty big challenge that we're all facing. The other sort of brief comment I'll make is that I've long been interested in the importance of ethical principles, AI principles, governance structures, and have worked on this for much of my career, in addition to deploying AI in practice in many different contexts. I drafted the AI principles at Google and worked on their implementation for many years. And I actually think internally I feel very, having insight into how it was received internally, I feel very optimistic about the fact that we could have quite significant institutional change as a result of operationalizing AI principles. So far, many of the AI principles I feel, around the world, and there are upwards of 100 or so governments and other institutions that have made statements about AI, haven't had the opportunity to operationalize them in practice. At Google, we did, because we had many different pieces of infrastructure, products, partnerships with third parties through cloud, which touched on sensitive aspects of AI principles and required very thoughtful consideration with respect to their interpretation and application. And so I think, once again, just to understate, there needs to be opportunities for operationalizing principles so that their effectiveness can be properly scrutinized, and then those principles themselves can be updated. And I think that's an important part of this whole framework.
And thank you, Mustafa. And this is exactly the perspective I'm coming from out in the fleet, where we're operationalizing these autonomous systems. We are literally, I know we had August Cole here earlier this morning, we are literally burning in the kit in the real world out there in the waters surrounding the Arabian Peninsula. So as you can see, we have a great panel here. We've got the full triple helix, government, academia, and industry represented. So we're going to get right into it in this topic of defense autonomy and trust. Here's the first question. I'm going to ask Jane this, if you'll get us started, and then we'll ask others to comment on it as well. What is uniquely challenging about trust in defense autonomous systems relative to their other use cases? This could be ethical, organizational, technological, social in nature. So just kind of an open-ended question there to get it started, but we wanted to start with you, Jane, so if you could take that.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the challenges are plenty. The first is really a definitional challenge, actually establishing what trust means. Establishing the definition, if you Google it, by the way, you'll get about 300 definitions of trust. And then being able to tie any of those definitions to something measurable and also to mission success is very difficult. On the one hand, we have the kind of societal and organizational trust that we're trying to get to, for instance, with our international partners, trust in adopting new technology. And on the very other end of the spectrum, we have warfighter trust, trust and reliance on their equipment in a real operational scenario. Now, especially in that situation, I think we should be very careful with our language. Trust is, we often talk about trust as something we can build or gain. I don't necessarily think that's the best language. Trust, or as we actually refer to it in the DoD, justified confidence, should actually be something that's calibrated. You only want to trust and rely on your technology where you know it has been tested and where you know it's going to perform well. And otherwise, we actually want our warfighters to be very skeptical of the technology if it hasn't been tested or if it is known to degrade in certain environments. So again, the calibrated, justified confidence is really what we're trying to get to. Now, also in the DoD, we operate obviously in very complex environments. We operate in environments where decisions are made sometimes very fast and very often in a very hierarchical way. And so figuring out what trust or even assurance, as a better defined term, means in that context exactly, and how to establish those assurance cases, how to build the body of arguments and evidence needed to convince somebody that their system is justifiably trustworthy is actually very difficult. Notably, this problem is in many cases similar to a problem that industry has. So there is a lot to be learned from industry. But we do often operate in environments where our stakes are higher and the consequences of failure are considerably higher. So the DoD needs to simultaneously partner with industry and learn from industry and academia in this case, but also invest in their own research, invest in their own technology that will elevate the test science and the assurance science to the level of our high stakes.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add a little bit to one of the things Jane said there. In commercial applications, self-driving cars being one example, a lot of the trust focuses on the safety side of it. Is anything bad going to happen if I do this? What's interesting in a military situation, we're already in a not that safe environment if it's being used. And so the other side becomes much more important, which is, can I trust the system to perform the job I need it to do, or am I going to have to send a human to make sure I get the job done? At the same time, there's the other risk, which is against a difficult adversary. Am I not being safe by not deploying it because I really need this, or I'm going to lose? And so I think that trust comes from experience. There's lots of things we do to build trust, to improve the safety of systems. But I always ask people, why do you get on an airplane? That's not even AI or autonomous, but there's a lot of work that goes into making them safe. Some of us could understand the work that goes into it, but the reason I get on an airplane is not because of all that analysis. It's just that I see a lot of them fly pretty frequently, and it usually turns out well. And so the only way we're going to get to that point is to start using these systems.
Definitely, and that's what we're seeing play out, as we put more systems into use in the real world, and where it's hot and sandy and salty, and Joe, did you want to comment on anything that's been said to this point, or take that one step further?
Yeah, I think, just from the operational, just reinforce, I think, some of the things that Jane said, and Mustafa, an interesting piece. For the operational level, I mean, the expectations, I think, for the military is, number one, we need to arm them with the best technology that's out there. So that's why investment is really important in doing this. And it is a difficult task in the Pentagon to get the right investment in the right place. Secretary Gates used to tell me when I was his assistant that there's a river of money that runs into the Pentagon. No one likes to hear that, but it's true. There's a lot of money that's misinvested, and this is where we're kind of underinvested. But investing in the research and development, the technology, making sure it's well tested, getting the people that are going to actually be out there that accept the consequences of using that autonomous system, they've got to get comfortable with it. Get them in early on the testing and the evaluation. Simulation is really important because it maybe doesn't get you all the way there, but it's a very efficient and effective way to get you there. But again, ultimately, for the people out on the battlefield, it's going to be the cognitive piece that plays with the machine. It's going to be their sensing, their knowledge, their experience. Those traits that are in the human probably can't be replicated to some degree, and ultimately they're going to have to make the decision on it. From the adversarial piece of it, again, I think it's very important to have ethical standards. There's legal standards, ethical standards. All of those things are important for us to establish because of maybe the democratic types of nations that we are. But adversaries don't care. They're not going to comply with any of those. Their ultimate goal, without consideration of collateral damage, or typically they don't care. If they get their mission done, destroy something, they're fine. They're always going to be after our systems. They're always going to try to infiltrate them, compromise them. And as I think you hit it on it's unlike, it's in a cars, it's safety, but you don't have people actually trying to undermine your system, and they'll constantly do that. But to me, that also means you can never cut that relationship off with constant innovation, constant collaboration with commercial and academia, because that's where the innovation keeps coming. Because my hope is when we get it, we hope we've got the best that there is. And then the resiliency of the systems. You just got to have something that's resilient. Are you going to trust what information you see because they've either injected false things in there? I mean, those are the types of things that most of the smart, not the old guys like me, but the smart young operators who are out there running these systems are very, very cognizant of. They think about the second and third order potential effects of what they do. And so I think, yeah, the technology piece of it, but you got to get them in. They're smart. They're tech savvy. This generation is so tech savvy. Get them in early on. It's easy to learn how to hit a target. with a weapon or put an aim point somewhere that you want it to go. But this type of stuff, it has to be taught. They'll learn it, but we got to start very early on to have the trust. Maybe not the trust, just the confidence in what they're using as a tool that will help them be successful, help them be mission success, save lives, and not have collateral damage.
Mustafa, any comments on what you heard to this point on this discussion of trust? Could you give the kind of industry perspective?
Yeah, I don't know about the industry perspective, but I think one thing that I've observed in practice is that utility is essential for creating trust. Like above all else, you don't have to people don't have to understand how the system does what it does, but if people have the opportunity to observe that it is effective in practice, that is the most powerful source of building trust. And what I've experienced is that people will quite quickly adjust and accept a system operating fairly autonomously if it continuously performs well. And that has, pros and cons, right? I've seen people get complacent and permit a system maybe not operating entirely independently, but certainly having significant, free rein on some of its actions. And that complacency is dangerous because the kind of human who is supposed to be overseeing a system and monitoring it, say minute by minute, it's quite difficult for a human to spot an error or an anomaly 1 in 100, right? And to pay attention for, every single one of those moments and really care, especially when you get accustomed to it performing so well consistently. And so I do think that utility drives it, but people will get very complacent very quickly. And I think, it's also important to think about the other commercial actors which are making progress really, really fast in the space. So it's probably better to have the expectation that, sort of national defense programs are unlikely to have a significant strategic advantage in this area for very long periods of time. I think that, we talked about Ukraine a little bit this morning with sort of Turkish, drones. These are inherently dual use tools. And so the commercial incentive to have, various kinds of UAVs, whether in the water or in the air or on the road, is going to drive their, sort of production and therefore their proliferation much, much faster than, sort of the defense, procurement approach. And that's going to create a lot of tension for us because I think many, many actors are going to be able to get hold of them and use them in ways that we might not like.
Yeah, Mustafa, just a comment from my perspective. I can literally see this playing out as we deploy various USVs with various levels of trust, and once the platform performs like you expect it to, you do not revisit it as much as you would normally expect to. And so I can see this kind of playing out in the real world. Jane, can you talk a little bit about the CDAO's ethical perspectives? I just want to go vertical on that for a minute, and I know you've got some. Did you craft those, by the way?
I did not,
okay.
But we do have some people in the room who did. So we are the first military to adopt the ethical principles for AI. Since then, multiple other nations have done so. And where we stand now with CDAO is we're trying to move into implementation. So we have the 5 ethical principles at this point. We have got direction from the Deputy Secretary to advance them across 6 different tenets. You can all probably find this online, so I won't belabor all of the various lists of things. But now we're moving into no-kidding implementation. And so what we're working on and what we're awaiting a signature on from the Deputy Secretary's office is a formal kind of pathway forward that will, no kidding, task various organizations in the Department of Defense with very specific actions as far as actually putting these principles into practice. A lot of it does overlap with test and evaluation, quite a bit of it actually does, but there are also multiple other pieces. Responsible AI is kind of everybody's job in the department, and so there are pieces of it that have to do with the international allies, there are pieces of it that have to do with responsibly acquiring these systems and responsibly developing these systems, and kind of, again, crafting all of those arguments and evidence that go into responsible AI.
Thank you, Jane. I'm going to go to an audience question here. And I'm just going to, this will be a jump ball, so anybody that wants to take it here. what are some of the quantifiable ways that DoD can measure trust? A jump ball there.
I'll start.
Okay.
I'll jump on that one. So probably the easiest way for us to do it has been measuring reliance, right? Trust tends to manifest itself in reliance. And so in our tests, and this is something that's very different for us. If you think, so I'm a career operational tester. That means that I've participated in testing multiple systems that the DoD has acquired over the years. Now, if I'm testing a tank, I would never give during the test an opportunity for my operator to not use a tank during the test, right? But with AI, that's actually precisely, we're having to incorporate basically free play into the way that we plan these events, because we have to give the operator an opportunity to not rely on the system if they don't find it sufficiently trustworthy. So reliance is probably the easiest and the most straightforward way to do it. Additionally, we also look at emergence of human behavior, right? If they actually start to rely on that technology, do they take on additional tasks? Do they come up potentially with off-label uses for the technology, as most service members tend to do when given the opportunity? So all of that has to be incorporated in our evaluation. And I want to stress here the importance of, in general, focusing and measuring human factors, which is something that I think traditionally we have not paid enough attention to.
Jane, I want to talk about T&E and actually go past T&E. I know you've got a very deep background in this. This question's for Joe and Jeff. The DoD has been doing T&E for decades, right? What new tools does the department need to go beyond T&E and deliver autonomous capability at pace? At pace is also something we talked about this morning. If you could.
Yeah, sure. That gets to the root of a big difference in how procurement and management of systems is done, right? So the DoD largely works in a waterfall process where requirements are specified up front, a long time is spent developing, there's some kind of acceptance test, and then the thing goes out to the field. Of course, that's not how the tech industry does it, right? They have an agile process, right? They do continuous development, continuous integration, and continuous testing. And so the example I like to give is at Uber, we never did demos, ever, because we had 2 code builds a day that went out to the track for testing, and the ones that succeeded went out to the road. And so when a VIP came by asking for a demo, we said just hop in the next test run, because we were always doing it. So to get back to your question, where we've got to change is we've really got to get to a testing and evaluation regime that's a everyday testing during development, but even after deployment, that the testing is in development is continuing every single day. And ideally, there would be test sites that are maybe not in harm's way, but there's a tight connection between what folks are seeing, like at TF59, saying, hey, we're seeing this with our system, and they can go back and run it back home on their test thing. Again, because there's a test every day anyway, just try it the next day.
Jeff, I just want to interject a point here. This is kind of the value prop for Task Force 59. We want the warfighter to be an intimate part of that process you discussed. And so we have kind of inserted ourselves into that equation because we're the problem holders, and we want to bring the problem holders together with the solution providers. Joe and Mustafa, did you have anything to add to that, or just did you want to comment?
A couple of, what's a metric? So, I obviously come from the soft community. A metric is use. Because people in the soft community who are engaged in conflict virtually every single night, so they're driven away from complacency. Because complacency actually, in its most basic sense, translates to casualties. So the guys in the special operations community became, complacency was never a word in their vocabulary because they experience it every night, and there's always chance, there's always fog, there's always all those things, whatever the trite comment about your plan never survives first contact. And that's why the cognition piece, I think, for operators becomes so important. But I think is it, from the department perspective, so I won't get it, it's a completely frustrating environment in the Department of Defense. The resources aren't aligned, the people aren't aligned. You can't take You can't take a new development or new technology that somebody comes in with, and that thing needs to be tracked and moved from it starts as a new technology, starts as looks something good, but it's got to some way have a pathway all the way to our program. It's all about money. Even in the role I had as Undersecretary for, supposedly oversight of NSA, NGA, DIA, if you don't have the money, you don't have it. And so for people in industry and venture capitalists and people who come in and throw down innovating pieces of technology, first we got to be innovative. We've got to continue to be that way. But there's just so much bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy resides in, candidly, I'll just say, in the Navy, all the services, they have all the money. There needs to be, in this particular area of AI, machine learning, and autonomy, needs to be a single point. I call it a task force, reports to the Secretary of Defense, and what he puts out is not recommendations, it's directions and orders, so to speak, or we'll never kind of get synergy and alignment to be able to bring to bear all the benefits of autonomy, and at the same time where there's so many tests and evaluation. I think every service has one. We just need to synergize some of our efforts, and then whatever, try something, fail fast, move forward. And I think that kind of lacks in the department. But I mean, it's gotten better, I think. But for the people probably out here who are always trying to figure out how to get into it, just incredibly bureaucratic. It takes so much time to get something done. As you said, in commercial, they just iterate and do it. That's why, moving in partnering with commercial and other firms out there that are actually doing this. I mean, we used to say a couple of things. 80% of the solutions out there for all of our technology, AI, machine, all that, that's already in industry. We just need to take it and engineer it for us, and I think that's the truth. And the other piece it is information dominance. That's what all this is about: being able to dominate, understand information. That's why AI and machine learning. That's what we need. Information is success down the road, and having it better than anyone else. But this is where it resides, and just pushing for that partnership. But it won't be critical of any of the people in the leadership. But it does take somebody just jamming it down the throats, candidly, of others. Say, you can't go off in your own direction. The services have their own money. Pick a lead service, give it to them, empower them, give them the resources, give them the decisions, establish somebody who reports to the secretary this area we're talking about is important enough in my mind to actually put into that framework. And then, candidly, better figure out how to work with Congress, because that's a key and critical element to it. But aligning those things up, I think, will posture us for, it's not novel, it's not new, we just need to keep pushing forward on trying to get to that position where we're just open up our arms, embrace it, understand the risks, move forward, get it out there, give it a try, teach people, make sure they have confidence in it by using it, and involve them, simulate it. Those are the types of things I think that'll gain us the better. The generation will take it and run with it. We just have to offer them the opportunity to get it and use it. So,
thank you, Joe. I'm going to actually shift gears again here and go to another audience question. And this one's actually, I'm going to associate myself with this, having stood up a new task force. And we talk a lot about robotics and AI. But my main focus has been getting the talent necessary to build a task force that can deliver at pace. And this one's for you, Mustafa. Having built a couple, very successful companies, are there changes needed to how we recruit, train, and educate the force for them to have confidence in autonomous systems and AI-driven systems?
No. Yes, of course.
Okay.
So, I think it's got to be, look, I think the good news and bad news at the same time is that these systems are getting much, much easier to build. So the technical know-how, the capital resource required is going down, the technical know-how is proliferating, and people without PhDs in machine learning can take advantage of APIs. They can very quickly implement things which are being open sourced. And that is, good on the one hand, because I think it broadens your pool of people from which you can recruit. But on the other, I think, it means that, many, many different adversaries are going to get their hands on these kinds of techniques, like really, really quickly. And people are sharing insight and know-how on the web all the time. And when I say open source, I mean, like, really the weights of the model and the code to implement the model and the training data that it was trained on, are increasingly open source and widely available. So I don't actually think that the problem is as big as it might have looked 5 years ago, when we may have thought that, you can only hire extremely qualified, very, very expensive people from Silicon Valley, and they need to be on full-time staff and so on within, the DoD. I think that has really changing very, very rapidly and is only going to continue changing, especially when it comes to the development of the algorithms. Obviously, integrating them into your existing hardware is a completely different story, but the plain development of the algorithms, I think, is much more accessible.
Jane and Jeff, could you comment on that as well, or just anything that Mustafa has mentioned that you wanted to talk about?
I think in general, talent is always the biggest issue, right? Maintaining, retaining and acquiring talent and keeping them in the DoD long enough, especially when our hiring pipelines are reasonably slow compared to industry, especially when we pay lower than industry. It's definitely making it more difficult for us. Now, with the CDAO, we are merging, one of the organizations we're merging with is Defense Digital Systems. They do have kind of in the DoD, a well-known and allegedly magical hiring pipeline that I'm really looking forward to learning about. They're considerably more creative than the rest of the department and how they hire and how they retain their staff. So I'm looking forward to seeing what that's like. In the end of the day, we do have a very unique mission, and I do think that that does attract enough individuals. Certainly what attracted me to the DoD is the mission. It is not the pay. But I think another thing we're kind of changing our minds on is what does employment in the DoD look like? Because I think historically we've seen people come into the DoD and make a career of it. And now we're seeing people like Sunman, like many others in the room, who have given a few years to the DoD, and then they go either back to or just go to private industry. And I think we're starting to really appreciate that. Come in, work with us for a couple of years, we'll absorb your greatness, and then if you want to have a fantastic career elsewhere, that's okay. And then now we have even better industry partners in those people.
Just one quick comment on that. Recruiting talent is always a problem because it's in high demand at all times. One of the puzzling things that the U.S. does, of course, is the immigration quotas on talented non-Americans who come here. Now, the DoD wasn't usually in a position to advocate for changing that because those wouldn't be the people they could recruit anyway, but they really should, because not having those tech positions filled is what creates the supply and demand mismatch we have. And so I think there's an opportunity there that's missed.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's, I don't know, if you want to look, for example, look at the space program. Who ran the space program back in the 60s? We didn't have a whole lot of problem. What did we do? We recruited a bunch of German people that came over there, and actually did it. So I'm kind of with you. The other thing, like the security clearances, all those things are very difficult. I'll tell you what, you can't hide much these days. And so is the security debacle that I inherited for security clearances for all the department. So we finally got to the point, that's all technology. You don't have to go through. I'll tell you 3 of my best friends to go ask about if I should have a security clearance. That's all going away because you can visualize people anyway through their networks and everything they've done over their career. So that's one thing, so you can actually test people, but that's a risk area that we should take. We should, in my mind, we should embrace people. The other thing on recruiting, you're exactly right. You better make some incentive, just because your assistant is a reserve.
Yes.
A highly smart intellectual person that's in the reserves, and so spends most of her time in industry using her intellectual capital and doing some great things, but can come in reserve duty. Yeah. To me, maybe that's a good way to hook people into the world that don't want to spend all their time in uniform. And listen, everybody doesn't have to carry a rifle and march and do all those things. We need to get away from that piece too. But how do you incentivize? I just think there's ways to do it. You got to get people to do public service, though. They got to be invested a little bit in some level of public service, whether they, again, go in the reserves and spend most of their time in industry working at Google, but maybe once a year they spend 2 weeks with us, and that inculcates, and they can bring into bear what I think will help with that recruiting. It's a tough nut.
And if Joe, if I could talk about that for a minute, we are leveraging the reserves in a big way at Task Force 59. It just so happens, a lot of our talent is reservists. Among them, we have 2 Forbes 30 under 30. One of them is in the room with us today, Skylar Moore. Obviously, she's a big player in this space. My deputy, when we stood up the task force, was the CEO for a $1 billion cybersecurity company. We've also got, Elsa Kania helping us out. I don't know if you know her. She wrote a book on called Fighting to Innovate on Chinese innovation. So there's a lot of talent in the reserves, and we've been kind kind of plucking that on Task Force 5.9?
You know, sabbaticals and things, you know, we started sabbaticals. I'll tell you from my community, the SEAL community, when I was running that, no SEAL wanted to go to the Naval War College, to the Army War College. Where'd they want to go? They wanted to go to Harvard, Stanford, Yale, somewhere where they could be immersed in something kind of different. And then they come out with whatever, you know, we had 2 or 3 guys went to the London School of Economics. I mean, so that type of immersion, the military just needs to be different. They don't forget how to fight, but mess around with their mind, you know, get their minds engaged in these types of things. And then companies, whatever, like a Google, a sabbatical that would go for 2 years and work and learn and have an understanding of it. It just inculcates those types of programs. We just need to, there's plenty of money to do that, but you know, we got to keep all of those institutions that we have in the military. But I think personally, we'd be better served getting educated and immersing ourselves somewhere where we're not comfortable.
One of the other key things that we leverage there at Task Force 59 is allies and partners. And this is another audience question. And Jane, this one's for you. So you spoke about measures that the United States is taking to earn allies' trust in AI and autonomous systems. How are we taking the standards of our allies and partners around AI into account?
So the JAIC and now CDAO, we do run what's called Partnership for Defense. It is a collaboration with 13 other nations. And then we have special, of course, bilateral conversations and agreements as well with other countries. We discuss at length things like our ethical principles and exactly how we're implementing them. We exchange lessons learned. In the case of our UK colleagues, even exchange technology in some cases for assurance and test and evaluation. In fact, the concept of AI assurance and building an assurance case was actually largely documented in the UK, so we worked a lot with the UK MOD to borrow some of those principles.
Any other comments on partners and allies in this space and trust, defense, and autonomy?
No, I mean, engaging with partners. I mean, I'm a big advocate. Of course, I spend every quarter over at NATO trying to convince, and it's a difficult, but the bottom line is, I don't know, maybe it goes back to the old saying that old historians know, you know, what Marshall used to always say, hey, never go to war alone and don't stay very long. So, but that does, you know, partnerships and building partnerships with NATO's and Five Eyes and sharing our practices, and you know, I think that's a really, and you have to embrace it and you have to take a little risk. I mean, it took me my whole time at the Defense Department to be able to get the Five Eye partners into the SCIFs. Come on, guys, what do you know? We just got to embrace partnerships, and you got to do that to a level with industry and take some risk. But that's the only way you're going to get that advantage. It is some risk, but I think it's an important, you know, partnerships are just.
Well, we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left. I actually wanted to just do a quick round the horn and any closing remarks, really any topic that interests you. And I'll start with Mustafa, if you want to lead us off here in this discussion about defense autonomy and trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting conversation. I think the main question is to maybe not over-index on the role of autonomy. I mean, autonomy has its place to play, but I think it comes a little further down the line than we currently are with developing AI systems. So, you know, there are a lot of very useful, practical ways that we can deploy machine learning systems, you know, that I think will give us much more control, build much more trust, and establish a precedent of these systems being, you know, accountable to us and useful. And then over time, as we've like demonstrated empirically that they can be contained, you know, fully under our control and safe, then I think we can sort of, you know, come closer to the question of autonomy. But sometimes I feel that we're sort of rushing ahead before we've even demonstrated to ourselves that we can control these systems. And I think, you know, in many cases that's not really proven out yet.
Joe, any comments either on that or any other topics?
Yeah. I mean, I think what you just said, Mustafa, we used to don't run to your death. You know, is how we kind of put it. Hey, make sure you understand the environment you're going to and understand. But I do believe that, you know, keep the balance right between, you know, the cognitive capabilities, you know, the sensing, the knowledge, the experience of the people that are going to have to use the systems, and just be very careful as you move along, I think, and then including those that have to use them, you know, in everything you do, whether it's a testing and evaluation, and whether it's the education piece. Again, I don't even have an advanced education. But as you said, I don't need it to appreciate what AI is and what other people can do, and gaining confidence and bringing those in. And you just have to, you can't give up. All the small startups, all the venture capitalists that put money into these things, we just have to persist and try to get into the rapid, proof of concept, authorities to operate, all those things, and there needs to be an iterative path for all the people that are willing to help the Defense Department. We just need to kind of make it more as efficient as we can, and I know Jane works on that all the time, and there just needs to be a synergy on doing that and making sure the benefits of artificial intelligence and machine learning are being brought to bear in the Defense Department, while at the same time, candidly, it's the companies who are investing get a return on investment. I mean, that's just the way it is, and it should be that way, and it ought to be beneficial to them. So I'm just, again, I'll always encourage the partnerships. I never said no to a company that wanted to come in and talk to me. And that was a Mattis piece. Mattis entertained any single company, small or otherwise, that wanted to talk. He would invite them in. So I'm going to listen to you. And the reason is because maybe if you're listening to them, the rest of the people that live in that clay layer that haven't had a creative thought in 20 years but are still resting around in the department are willing to embrace the new energy that's going.
And Joe, I can tell you we have the same approach at Task Force 59. Jeff, any final words?
Yeah, exactly. I would just like to advocate a little bit for DoD's increased engagement with academia. They've tended to treat this a little bit arm's length, just from a data security, information security point of view, but there's much lost opportunity there. And just to give yet another example, on the early side, on the requirements side, if you ask a warfighter what they want, we often see an answer that looks like, well, I want an autonomous wingman. They'll be next to me, I'll tell them where to go, and there'll be an extra set of eyes for me. I'll look at what they can see, it's going to be awesome. And then you ask an academic, and an academic will say, well, that's cognitive overload. You don't need more jobs to do. And by the way, the technology is already advanced far enough where they can be fully autonomous and take missions on their own. So it's just a much different perspective, and I would advocate for having more of those conversations.
Yes, Jeff, and I couldn't agree with you more. There's such value in that triple helix approach, government, academia, and industry. Looking forward to partnering with you in the future. All right, Jane, I guess the final word's going to be yours.
I get the last word. I love it. I guess I want to just focus on the importance of AI assurance in order to build the kind of trust that we discussed here today, both for the warfighter, but also for all of the other assurance stakeholders. In the end of the day, we really cannot put all our resources into fielding AI-enabled systems without making sure that they work first. The DoD has never operated that way, and we will continue to operate in an assured system space. If we were to kind of flood our warfighters today with untrustworthy or incapable systems, not only would we waste taxpayer dollars, but we would also potentially have catastrophic consequences, and we would erode warfighters' trust in their equipment. And so we're really kind of at the forefront of either creating a foundation of AI integration or AI skepticism. And so I think we all agree on the direction that we actually want to go. And what we want to do is use AI assurance to achieve asymmetric advantage over our peer and near-peer adversaries by creating much more robust AI-enabled systems, by being able to experiment with them during test events, by figuring out their operational envelopes, and by understanding where they're most risky and how we can mitigate those risks.
Oh, thank you, Jane, and thank you, Jeff and Joe and Mustafa, and thank you, Applied Intuition and Atlantic Council for hosting us today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I know I did. This is particularly relevant to my work and well worth the trip. So I think we're off to the next event. I can see them lining up here. So thank you for